physiology of a skeletal muscle fiber. Okay, we are going back to talk about action potentials. I know, I heard that sigh, but this is the last time. Okay, so let's do it. Okay, just a reminder, if you can think of the nerves that help motor control of the body, just a little reminder, they're going to start in the brain. Okay, the body of those cells are going to be in the brain. Okay, they travel down the spinal cord and they exit the front of the cord to go out to muscle. So the front of the cord is what's going to help control motor control of the body. Okay, one nerve goes to a muscle and then divides down, and each muscle fiber has one junction. Okay, so each muscle fiber is going to have one junction with that nerve. It's a very important concept. Okay, synaptic cleft. I know this is probably tough to read on this. Let's go over, okay, synaptic cleft. So what this picture is showing you, and once again, I would open this up in your book, is the nerve that's going down to a muscle cell. Okay, so this is going to be the nerve going down to a muscle cell. Okay. What needs to happen in general is going to be 3 major steps. In action potential, just a little reminder, an action potential is going to be the electrical activity that happens in a nerve or a muscle that makes that nerve or muscle work. Okay, so an action potential is going to be the electrical activity in a nerve or muscle that makes them work. What happens for a muscle cell to contract or a muscle to contract is we need to have an action potential travel down the nerve. That action potential will release what's called a neurotransmitter. That neurotransmitter is going to facilitate the start of an action potential in the muscle cell. So the nerve is going to work, it's going to send a signal to the muscle cell will then work through an action potential. Okay, so action potential, neurotransmitter, action potential. We need to talk about the specifics of this, okay? We're going to talk about the specific steps of an action potential next, but I just want you to understand it's the electrical activity that makes a nerve or a muscle work. Okay? An action potential will travel down a nerve. I'm going to try to put the steps up here. I may have to, you know what, I'm going to start over here. Okay? So an action potential down the nerve. Okay? At the end of the nerve, calcium is released. Okay. It's contained in little synaptic vesicles, usually. When an action potential comes down that nerve, it breaks open those synaptic vesicles. Calcium is freed up. Calcium then goes to the end of the axon or the nerve. Okay? So, action potential down the nerve, calcium is released into the end of that nerve, doesn't leave the nerve, stays in the nerve. Okay? And it's going to stimulate the release of a neurotransmitter. In this case, when we're talking about skeletal muscle, the neurotransmitter is going to be acetylcholine. Okay? So calcium is released and stimulates the release of acetylcholine into, seeing if you could read it, the synaptic cleft. Okay, also known as the synapse, also known as the synaptic gap. Okay? That acetylcholine goes into this space and then attaches to receptor sites on this muscle cell. Okay? So acetylcholine goes into this space and attaches to receptor sites on the muscle cell. That acetylcholine then stimulates the action potential that goes down that muscle cell. Okay? So ACH is an abbreviation for acetylcholine. Stimulates muscle action potential, which makes the muscle contract. Whew, that is a whole lot of talking, okay? So, action potential, end of the nerve. Calcium is released to the end of the nerve, not out of the nerve. Releases acetylcholine. Acetylcholine crosses the synaptic cleft, is attached to the muscle cell receptors, stimulates an action potential in the nerve, which causes, the muscle, which causes the muscle to contract. Okay, you'll never have to hear me say it again. You're done. We do have to talk about action potentials though. I know this is a lot. If this doesn't make sense to you, once again, review it in your book, come see me. I'd be happy to go over it with you. Okay, so action potential. While I have us focused in here, move to your next PowerPoint slide, and I'd like to talk to you about the electrical activity that happens in an action potential. Okay. So, there's a lot that happens in an action potential. I'm going to go over the basics that I want you to know and memorize. Okay. There are three main numbers that you need to memorize. -70 millivolts, -50 millivolts, +30 millivolts. Okay. What these stand for, so this is going to be our voltage, this is going to be time. Okay. On our graph, we're going to create a graph here. -70 is resting. Okay, resting membrane potential. Okay. Resting membrane. Okay, -70. -50 is going to be threshold. Okay. What that means is if the charge on a cell membrane becomes more positive and it reaches 50, it will undergo an action potential. Okay. If a resting cell becomes positive enough to meet -50, it will undergo a full action potential. Okay. +30 is going to be the peak of the action potential. Okay, so let's go over these steps. What happens when we are watching an action potential being graphed is it looks something like this. There are three major steps that I want you to know. This first step is depolarization. Okay. Depolarization is going to be when we have a positive ion, specifically sodium, in some cases calcium. Okay, when we get to the heart, we'll talk about that. Sodium will enter the cell. Don't forget, sodium is a positively charged ion. If we start to pour sodium into the cell will become more positive. Good. Okay. So if it becomes more positive, we start to get this move towards positive on our graph. Reaches -50, boom, an action potential happens. It'll peak at +30. Those sodium ions stop moving into the cell. Okay, boom. Now what happens is we start to get a more negative charge. I shouldn't say more negative charge, a more negative cell. Okay. How this happens is through a process called repolarization. Okay. Repolarization. What happens with repolarization is potassium moves out of the cell. Potassium, once again, is a positively charged ion. If we move it out of the cell will become more negative. Okay. Potassium channels are slow to close. So once that cell gets back to -70, those channels are slow. They close slowly, so we get some leakage of those positive ions out, and we undergo a process called hyperpolarization. Okay, and that's because sodium channels are slow to close. Okay, slow to close. Depolarization, repolarization, hyperpolarization. Refractory period is going to be the period in which the cell is resetting its electrical charge. Okay, it's moving potassium and sodium through sodium-potassium pumps to reestablish that concentration grade. Refractory period, the cell cannot be stimulated again. Okay. Okay. Action potential. I know that you probably cannot see this really well, this picture. I apologize. I should have made that larger. But if you can't, I know that there's pictures in your book, or you can Google a picture online of an action potential. This is a pretty good summary of what I want you to know, though, picture-wise. Okay. Excitation, contraction, coupling. This is everything that we talked about. This is a fancy schmancy name for it. Excitation is when we have the action potential stimulate that muscle cell. Contraction, coupling, is when the actin and myosin overlap and shorten. Okay. Calcium is going to be released. I want you to know, once again, that's from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay. Helps the sliding of those filaments. Muscles respond to stronger stimuli. So you can either recruit more muscle cells in a muscle, or you could send more constant signals to keep stimulating it. Okay, there's different ways that you can stimulate the different muscle cells. If you recruit more muscle fibers, of course, you're going to have a stronger contraction. Okay. Contractions of muscles. Muscle tone, we talked about tonicity. It's that slight contraction of muscles, keeping them ready to work. Okay. Then we have two gross movements that are called isotonic and isometric. Okay. I'm going to move in on the smartboard so you can actually just see me. So, isotonic and isometric. If I pick up a 20-pound weight, let's imagine this is a 20-pound weight. With my bicep muscle, the movement of the bicep, once again, is flexion of the elbow. Okay. Isotonic contractions means that I'm moving that muscle. I'm moving the joints, the bone. Okay, so we're actually having movement. Concentric contraction is when that muscle shortens. So I've got my 20-pound weight, bending the arm, or 10-pound weight, I'm bending the arm, the muscle shortens, the arm is moving. That's an isotonic concentric contraction. Okay. If I now have a 50-pound weight and I'm trying to lower it very slowly, okay, I'm using my biceps. The biceps is slowly lowering that. It's kind of unhinging as it goes, okay? And as I'm fighting gravity, that muscle's working, but it's lengthening. That's called eccentric contraction. Don't mistake that with stretching, okay? So eccentric contraction is when those levers, instead of just letting go and letting that weight fall, those little levers are unhinging the muscle slowly, okay? We can't start from a resting state and contract a muscle and we can't start in a resting state and lengthen a muscle. But if the muscle is shortened, we can slowly unhinge it. And that unhinging, that lowering against gravity is called eccentric contraction, okay? If you can imagine that I walk up to the table that's in front of me, and I have my arm, I'm going to back out again, okay? I have my arm underneath this table, okay? This table's pretty heavy. I am using my bicep muscle. I'm going to flex at the elbow. I'm going to try to move that table as hard as I can. Is my bicep muscle working? Absolutely. Is it moving? Not at all, okay? That is an isometric contraction. Isometric is when the muscle is working, but not moving. Okay, so isotonic is movement, concentric is shortening, eccentric is lengthening, okay, from a contracted state. Isometric is when the muscle doesn't move at all. Okay. Muscle metabolism. Okay, muscle metabolism. I'm going to zoom in on this PowerPoint so you can see this. Okay. If you remember, we've got ATP. Now, ATP is adenosine triphosphate. It's a high energy molecule. What happens is, if ATP is going to help something create or get energy, it sends a phosphate to it. Okay, so if ATP is going to help a structure get energy, it sends a phosphate to it. So if ATP loses a phosphate, it turns into ADP. It sends a phosphate away to do its work. It's now ADP. Okay, and ADP can turn into ATP, and ATP can turn into ADP, back and forth and back and forth. In muscles, we've got 3 ways to create ATP. The first one sounds really fancy, but it's actually pretty commonsensical. Direct phosphorylation means we send a phosphate to ADP by creatine phosphate. You may have heard of that. That's one of the main suppliers of energy to muscle. Okay? And we turn ADP into ATP. Okay? Now, the thing with this energy supply is it's only good for short bursts of energy. Okay? Anaerobic mechanisms is when glucose is going to be used through a process called glycolysis, which we'll get into when we get into metabolism in general. Okay, so through glycolysis, glucose is going to generate 2 ATP. Okay. Now, the thing about anaerobic mechanism is it doesn't have oxygen. Okay, it doesn't have oxygen. This is used especially with sprinters. Okay, if you could think of how hard a sprinter's muscles are working, it actually clamps so hard, their muscles clamp down so hard that they block the blood supply. And of course, our blood supply is where oxygen comes from. Okay, so the muscle has to figure out how to create energy without that oxygen, and the way that it does it is through anaerobic mechanisms. Okay, they provide quick spurts of energy, but it's small amounts of energy. Okay, only 2 ATP are created per cycle of anaerobic mechanism. So it's not a lot of energy, is it? But it's good for short spurts of energy, sprinting, powerlifting, etc. Now, aerobic respiration. Okay, aerobic respiration means that we're going to be using glucose and oxygen. It's going to go into the mitochondria, which are the powerhouse of the cell, and it's going to create a whole whopping 36 ATP. Okay, so aerobic respiration is great when you have lots of glucose, lots of oxygen, creates a lot of energy. Aerobic respiration is great for longer term sustained activities, prolonged running, you know, daily activities where you're going about your day. Okay, we're going to use aerobic respiration. Okay, so 3 ways: direct phosphorylation, anaerobic, and aerobic. Direct phosphorylation and anaerobic are good for short spurts of energy. Aerobic is going to be much better for long, sustained energy. Okay, muscle fatigue is when glycogen and oxygen run out and muscles cannot contract, but they can also be stuck into states of contraction. If you've seen somebody with a muscle cramp, they've been totally depleted of ions and glycogen. Okay, so muscle fatigue. Muscles can only go so long without stores of energy. Okay. Muscle fiber type, there are slow fibers, there are fast fibers. Everyone has slow and fast fibers. It's kind of an interesting thing. They have found that with people such as marathoners, they have more slow fibers. They're fatigue resistant. They're definitely not me, I'll tell you that much. Lots of blood, lots of oxygen, lots of glucose. They're really good at that prolonged activity. Okay. They have fast fibers as well, but they have a more predominant amount of slow fibers. Fast fibers fatigue quickly. They're very strong though, okay? Very strong. So these fast fibers, once again, are going to be your hard sprinters, your, power lifters, okay? People who do those activities when they are studied under a microscope, their muscles are studied, they have more of those fast fibers, okay? So we all have both. People can have more of one or the other. Okay. Microscopic structure of smooth muscle, we went over this at the beginning. It has what's called that spindle-shaped appearance. Spindle means it's pointed at both ends, and it's got one nucleus in the center. We're going to talk about how smooth muscle is oriented in the GI tract when we get there. There is what's called a circular layer and a longitudinal layer. What those two layers help to do is to create different ways to move foodstuffs through the intestines, okay? Longitudinal, you may have heard of this, most people do, creates peristalsis. And peristalsis helps those gross movements of foodstuffs through the intestines, okay? Helps to mix it a little bit. The circular layer really helps to mix and churn foodstuff. We'll talk about that more specifically in GI, okay? What I want you to know about now with smooth muscle is that it is found in organs such as the GI tract, the respiratory tract, okay? Has that spindle shape with one nucleus and no striations. Contraction of smooth muscle. They also have actin and myosin. Smooth muscle is not nearly as regular or symmetrical as it is in skeletal muscle. Okay, ATP is going to be the big supplier for energy, as it is with other tissues of the body. Has very low energy requirements because the contractions are slow and steady. And you want them to be slow and steady so you can absorb nutrients from your foodstuffs and water. Regulation, contraction of smooth muscles, neural. Quick review. There's sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation to smooth muscle. Okay. Sympathetic is fight or flight. The hormone that will be released from the sympathetic nerves will be norepinephrine. Parasympathetic is going to be acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter. Okay. Parasympathetic is going to be calm and relaxed. So this will be the part of the nervous system that will stimulate the GI tract when we are in a resting state, parasympathetic. That's the point. We're resting, we're relaxing, we're digesting, okay? If we're getting chased by a bear, sympathetic nervous system is going to be much more worried about stimulating your skeletal muscles to get out, run away, okay? So neural regulation, parasympathetic is going to stimulate digestion, okay? Sympathetic will stop digestion. Hormonal, there are several hormones that will regulate the contraction of the smooth muscle in the GI tract. We'll talk about those in the future. Okay. Muscular dystrophy. Muscular dystrophy is a very sad disease. It's a disease in which the muscle fibers and cells are replaced with connective tissue and fat. There are differing types of muscular dystrophy, from fairly benign to more aggressive. Once those muscle cells or fibers are lost, they're permanently replaced with connective tissue or fat. Okay, so with muscular dystrophy, one of the signs with children is when they get up off the floor, I think it's between 2 to 3 years of age, they start to push on their legs and they can't stand straight up. Okay, that can be a potential, not always, a potential sign of muscular dystrophy. Their muscles are not strong enough to pull them into an upright position. Okay, so like I said, there's varying intensities of this degree, from fairly benign to more aggressive, to where a patient would start to lose the ability to walk and move around. Myasthenia gravis is an autoimmune. We've talked about autoimmune before, a quick review. Autoimmune means the body's immune system does not recognize some of its tissues as its own. In myasthenia gravis, strangely enough, that patient's immune system does not recognize the receptors for acetylcholine on skeletal muscles as their own tissue, and they destroy the receptors of acetylcholine on skeletal muscle. So if you've destroyed those receptors, you can't get acetylcholine to stimulate that skeletal muscle, and the skeletal muscles won't contract, okay? So what happens is if you inject someone with acetylcholine, you give them a large amount of acetylcholine, it can stimulate what few receptors they have. They get a burst of energy. It wears off pretty quickly. It dissipates pretty quickly. And they get tired again. Okay, so with myasthenia gravis, it's autoimmune, destroying those receptors for acetylcholine and skeletal muscle. And they don't have energy. They're very lethargic unless they get injections of acetylcholine. I know that there are more and new medications out that are helping these patients greatly. Okay, that's the end of the lecture for musculoskeletal. Please, at any time, if you have any questions about this, come see me. I'd be happy to review it at any time. Thanks so much and have a great week. We'll see you in lab.